Hi everyone, thank you for coming to this session 1. It's just kicked over to 11 o'clock, so in the interest of staying on time, I will start. So thank you very much for coming, and to the presenters who are presenting today. This theme this morning is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander education theme, and the theme includes techniques used to embed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues or content into the curriculum, enabling strategies and practices and/or Indigenous ways of knowing. We did have 3 presentations in this stream, but unfortunately, one of the presenters has had to withdraw, and so we now have the 2 sessions for today. We have allowed 15 minutes for each session, but because we've only got the 2, I'm not opposed to going over time if there's great conversation to be had. So we'll see how we go with each session. What we'll do is we'll start with Mary Francis and the missing link: blocks, barriers, blindness, legacies of colonisation in non-Indigenous educator and citizen.
Yeah. Thank you, Celeste, and thank you to the university for this opportunity in the session called Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, labelled as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. I speak into this space as a non-Indigenous person and academic, and I speak into this space because it's a cultural interface where non-Indigenous people are part of or significant part of the problem. I begin by acknowledging I live in the country of the Darumbal people, and I pay my respects to Darumbal elders past and present, and all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their elders past and present. I acknowledge your sovereignty and that your sovereignty has never been ceded. I want to thank First Nation scholars for their scholarship, and I'm going to begin this session with a reflection on Celtic epistemology, and in particular the dream. And this was a dream I had when I thought to present this paper. And I think this dream conveys a way of knowing of the unsafe space you are in when you actually critique the academy and the society. So in the dream, I was in North Rockhampton looking south over the Main Bridge, and knowing I had to cross the Fitzroy River. Of course, the bridge in the dream was not a bridge of the world of Rocky. It was narrow, slightly wider than an overpass. It was strewn with signs of closure, roadworks. I ascended on foot. I had to, you see. I was impelled to cross the river. I had to get to the other side. And as I walked higher looking down, I saw the railings had fallen off the edge of the bridge. As I crept further, they were all gone. The edge dropped straight into the ground below. The railings languished in the middle, blocking the way. I was afraid, the drop, the height. I was walking alone, so afraid I would fall. I had to bend down and finally, on all fours, creep forward. I had to get over the river. I had to get over the bridge. I saw people on the other side. But as I crawled over the Fitzroy or Tunaba River, my hands moving forward began to sink into the concrete. The concrete itself became soft, as if it were a mattress. I had to come back. I came back to the north side to get to firm ground. I saw a policeman. I thought I would escape his attention, but he stopped me and he said, "What is your full name?" So I am a non-Indigenous Australian. I am Irish. I recognise that Australia is a settler colonial context, a non-Indigenous dominated neo-colonial context. As my colleagues in similar discipline areas recognise, I work in a first world institution on issues concerning colonial relations of power in Australia, which are not mentioned in any of the possible sessions to present here other than the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander section. And what this fits neatly into is the idea of a problem to be resolved. The problem is named as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And as academics, including Hogarth state, the very positioning of First Nation people as a deficit and a problem. So we have Bambit, Ford, Hogarth, no doubt. So adopting the lens of colonialism, it is an institution, not an event, as Woolf argues. And when it is presented as the problem of culture, culture is conceived, as Park says, in an objectified body of knowledge constituting the legitimate foundation for the building of interventions. But the interventions cannot be considered other than the instrument which reinforces the subjugating paradigm from which it is fashioned. The concept of culture, constructed from within an orthodox, hegemonic discursive paradigm, is employed as a marker of deficit. So in this colonial context, neo-colonial context of Australia, some would argue neo-colonial, we have personal racism, institutional racism, and also epistemic racism. Racism is negative, is responsible for injury and death. Racism, while contagious, is not measles. One cannot know one is not a racist. So how do we reflect on racism? These are the barriers that the literature evidences, the affective barriers, shame, guilt, denial by non-Indigenous people, barriers of knowledge, the great Australian silence, which continues, the barrier of nationalism, national identity, the barrier of our history, and the shame of colonialism. The focus of observation, the units that the students study are named Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander units, looking at continually the anthropological lens which defocuses non-Indigenousness, white nations, and other migrant peoples within Australia. So what is the basis and what is the cure that the institutions place on this issue? Currently, there is change, and I acknowledge change has occurred in the university, and I position myself also not simply in the literature of colonialism, but also in management literature, which in some ways has a literature of hope, because people like Ward and Corbett talk about the importance of ethics in this space, that the academy can change if it is challenged. So this is a space of hope which the paper positions. So we have an understanding, the importance of understanding that racism exists. We cannot know that we are not racism. And what colonialism has done from the construction of the Irish by the British and on through Algiers, as Sartre reports, we have the construction of the Indigenous person. They have to be savage, they have to be deficit, they have to be a problem in order to justify colonialism. So we have the university and the school approach, the tick the box, the one unit that will cure everything. I am your fairy godmother, I am your lecturer, you will do all of these things in my unit or the units that the system provides to create change. What is the research on these units? There's only actually 2 pieces of research on the efficacy of these units, and both suggest they are problematic. And I contend they are problematic because there is so much to do in these units that is impossible with one unit. But as we know, institutions institutionalize privilege. So the unit is created as the solution, which positions Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people as the problem to be solved. The bulk of the students are non-Indigenous. The solvers are therefore implicitly named as non-Indigenous. So let's look at what has occurred in the literature. So Craven's report in 2005 evidence that while students are more knowledgeable, they are no more likely to engage in teaching this content. The Luke's report in 2013 identified that over a school week, a teacher spends 4.5 minutes on average on Indigenous content. So what this is 17 times less in my maths than one would expect. given Indigenous students make up 5% of the population, but they're also 8% of the population in places like Tasmania. So this is 27% less than the content one would expect. So it suggests that these units, or the systems that these young people or old people go to when they qualify, are preventing justice in this. So this is the issue of systemic knowledge. That is the way knowledge is constructed. And the idea then is the importance of this space of overlap, where First Nation and non-Indigenous cultures overlapped and intersect. And this is the space where non-Indigenous people need to unravel their imaginings and their knowledge. We have the impact of, abbreviated to GAS, the Great Australian Silence. This is present in colleagues in the academy. It's present in schools. And if you send young or new workers out, new professionals, they enter an institution that is dominated by people with limited understanding of First Nations culture, and almost no understanding, because since Nakada created the term cultural interface, it's a relatively new term. It's not in a lexicon probably outside of Indigenous studies. So racism operates conscious level, below conscious level. It's affective and it's knowledge-based. So
that's 10 minutes, Mary Frances.
Okay, so a knowledge-based approach will not deal with the issues that occur with students in these units, the affective aspects of this. So you need to have the affective and you need to have the knowledge base. You need to be able to support students in this, and there's just a huge range of tasks that need to be done in this one unit. So therefore, we're dependent on people who work in this area, colleagues in other areas, and the Academy talks about decolonising. And yes, we can put in First Nation content, Indigenous epistemologies and ontologies, and they're rich and wealth that they add to non-Indigenous understandings and our ethical understandings and our limited ethical understanding. So speaking back into management speak, these are the issues that need to be resolved. To unpack racism, because we have levels of racism. We cannot say, ontologically speaking, that we are not racist. We cannot know that we are not racist. So the safest thing is to assume that we have racisms, and then to give students structures to scaffold their understanding through the affective and the knowledge base, and the capacity to decolonise. But you can see that what First Nation people want in this is capacity to teach their children. So this unit has multiple perspectives embedded in what it's taken to do, and it is almost very rarely unpeeled back. Even the AITSL standards, for those of you who are teaching, have a largely...
12 minutes, Mary Frances.
Thank you. Have a largely anthropological base, the study of the other. So the position of this paper, based on a huge range of scholarship, is that racism has to be normalised, not accepted, so that people can understand the colonial knowledges that they bring. So if we did one piece of research in one university was, let's ask lecturers where they embed this content. There were no responses to that. So that was in School Faculty of Education, no responses to that. So what is taking place in this embedding space? I would suggest that the senior academics in the Academy have limited background in the area. I'm privileged because of my area of expertise, and I would proffer as a solution that the Academy, to deinstitutionalise colonial privilege, has to engage in a non-Indigenous awareness, epistemological awareness of how these knowledges are embedded. How can we have a university that produces arts graduates, some universities do this, and have no Indigenous content, and then expect them to teach in this area. 85% of teachers do nothing in Indigenous content from the research of Luke's and all. So Zambalas talks about the affective, institutional racism. I'm not swearing, it's in the literature. Harper, Pinkelton, Denison, Slick, Wagner. It exists, it needs addressing, and the magic wand is not a sufficient solution. We are, growing up in Australia as non-Indigenous people, racist. It's not a binary, it's not like measles. You don't have it or you don't have it. It has overt, covert, conscious, and importantly, below conscious levels. And those below conscious levels enable institutional privilege. Can change be effective? Yes, this is an unusual approach. These are some comments from students who have undergone an ethical and critical awareness. So looking at how preconceived understandings of First Nations people need to be interrogated prior to or with developing knowledges of Indigenous epistemologies, etc. I would suggest that this can be done. It's a more complicated task. It's always seen as, if it occurs, cultural awareness training for non-Indigenous people about First Nation people. Non-Indigenous people grow up in a colonial culture, neo-colonial culture, and are not aware of these epistemic issues. Terms like Australian history, which don't have Aboriginal or Torres Strait Island history. Terms like Australian literature that don't include First Nation literature. These are epistemic issues. They're not the name calling, but they are embedded in the way. So solutions moving forward.
That's time, Mary Frances. What am I?
Yeah, that's all right. There were enough conclusions there.
You've done well. What I was going to say actually is that I might open to questions to see if we can have some targeted conversation about this, and see if people want to make a comment. If so, just hold that thought, Mary Frances. Does anyone have a comment? So you can either raise your hand on the participants tab, or you can type something in the Zoom group chat, and see how we go from there. Does anyone want to say anything? Ask Mary Frances anything? Make a comment? So from my perspective, of course, I'm a non-Indigenous person, so the conversations like this are really valuable to me, and make me aware of just how embedded racism is, and how unconscious we are as non-Indigenous people of the racism that does occur. Melinda.
Oh, hi, Celeste. Thanks, Mary Frances. That was a very courageous presentation. So thank you very much. I appreciate your courage to talk about quite a sensitive, an issue that can be quite sensitive. My question for you is around Indigenisation versus decolonisation of curriculum, and if you have any thoughts about what should come first, or can they be done together, or what is more important to do? You kind of touched on a bit of that, but I just thought I'd ask you a more direct question about Indigenisation versus decolonisation.
So from a non-Indigenous perspective, I would listen to the voice of the people in the country in where I am residing. My own experience is that they are complementary, and they build on each other, that the two must go together. You can't have a focus on non-Indigenous people, because this just privileges non-Indigenous people yet again. Non-Indigenous, First Nation Indigenous content, indigenising the curriculum is of course essential and part of that process. So I would say, Melinda, they are in that cultural interface and need to be done. But I would defer to the people on whose country I live opinion about how that should take place. I just want to privilege in this presentation the non-Indigenous problem and the problems of the coloniser, which we are typically blind to. Does that answer you?
Yeah, yep, no, that's a fair answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Melinda. Does anyone have any other questions for Mary Frances? What we could do while I'm waiting for people to think if they've got any questions, what we might do, Mary Frances, is I hope you can hang around for the next session, the next presentation, and at the conclusion of the next presentation we will have some time, so perhaps we can have another chat then following the second presentation. That'd be all right with you, Mary Frances?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So on behalf of everybody, I'd just like to thank Mary Frances for her presentation. If we could just show her appreciation. Okay, what we'll do is we'll move to the second presentation, the Indigenous Male Students in Higher Education, a study of the intersection between race and gender in an Indigenous enabling course. The main author of this article, Bronwyn McFarlane, is unable to be with us, so Laurie is going to present on her behalf. So Laurie, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Mary Frances. That was yeah, very a good presentation, and something that I'll have to listen to again, because I was just not sort of settled enough to listen properly because I had this presentation to do. But I do appreciate that. Thank you so much, and I'm all for people knowing for themselves, and the best way to do that is certainly by talking to other Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in the area where they live. So very good. But for me, good morning. I'm Laurie Armstrong, and today I'm filling in for my colleague Bronwyn McFarlane, who's the head of the course in the tertiary entry program. Some unexpected things come up for Bronwyn. She couldn't make it today, so it's me. So I'm a lecturer in the tertiary entry program, commonly known as TEP. And TEP is an Indigenous specific enabling course offered at CQUniversity. The title of this presentation is Indigenous Male Students in Higher Education, a study of the intersection between race and gender in an Indigenous enabling course. I'm grateful for the support of my academic colleagues, Dr. Ross Skinner and Bronwyn McFarlane, in the preparation of this. And please allow us to pay our respect to the traditional owners of this land, and where we are now is the Durrumbal country, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander elders, past and present, and also any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islanders attending today. I'd also like to say at the beginning is that when I use the word Indigenous throughout this presentation, I am talking about Australian Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. So firstly, we need to look at the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous education in Australia. This gap is a result of historical, social and cultural factors, but regardless, this gap can be seen from the first year of schooling. Across all years of schooling, there is about a 10% gap in overall national attendance rates. But this gap widens significantly during secondary school. In the 2016 census, over 45% of non-Indigenous students completed Year 12, but less than 20% of Indigenous students did the same. So we can see that it's not a level playing field when Indigenous Australian students aspire to higher education. The education gap continues to widen during tertiary education. Indigenous Australians make up only about 1% of university enrolments in Australia, and yet they represent 3.3% of the Australian population. This is well below parity and shows the enormous challenge in closing the gap in this area. I'd like to reiterate that the educational gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians begins at school, and although greater numbers of Indigenous Australians are now completing Year 12, a majority of these are not involved in further study after leaving school. educational success for Indigenous Australians also continues to be more difficult to attain after they've enrolled in tertiary education. And this is shown in a comparison of completion rates. The ABS found that in 2018, the completion rate for Indigenous Australian university students was about 40%. This is drastically low in comparison to the completion rate for non-Indigenous students, which is more than 66%. A non-Indigenous Australian is now more than 4 times likely to have a university degree than an Indigenous Australian. We've seen during this brief discussion already that Indigenous status or race or ethnicity is a vital factor in educational outcomes. But this is something that many of us are already aware of through the media and so on. However, on the next slide, I'd like to look at ways in which a person's gender or sex might affect educational outcomes. So, on the previous slide, we saw how the educational gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians have begun in the school years, but this is also where a gap starts to appear between Indigenous Australian males and females. Biddle and Meal stated in 2016 that from preschool attendance all the way through to school test scores and university degree attainment, Indigenous men are lagging behind their female counterparts. And the negative effects of this last well into adult life, as demonstrated by life expectancy figures and incarceration rates. In the 2016 census, about 22% of Indigenous females had completed Year 12, in comparison to only about 18% of Indigenous males in the population. Indigenous Australians achieved parity in attendance at technical or further education institutions with an overall attendance rate of 3.3%. But Indigenous females still outnumbered their male counterparts by a ratio of 1.5 to 1. This gender gap widened at university, where almost twice as many Indigenous females than males attended in 2016. When we look at completions at university level, we can see that the gender gap widens even more, with female Indigenous students having more than twice as many completions as their male counterparts. Of all measures in the 2016 census, it was only in attainment of TAFE certificates that Indigenous males outperformed Indigenous females by a ratio of 1.3 to 1. The fact that there are issues of gender beyond race and that there are issues of race beyond gender can be seen in statistics produced by the ABS in 2018 that showed that overall female students make up about 58% of total domestic students, whereas Indigenous female students make up about 66% of the Indigenous cohort of students, a significant difference. Indigenous females outperform their male counterparts academically to a much greater extent than that found in the general population. So racial differences in educational outcomes should not be considered without taking gender differences into account, just as gender differences must take racial differences into account. Now we're at the right slide again. While the previous slides have been more exploratory in nature, this slide takes a practical view of a study that we did into gender differences among Indigenous Australians in our TEP course here at CQUniversity. The study looked at all enrolments of TEP students from 2003 to 2017 and at how many of these students had completed TEP. Specifically looking at gender differences in outcomes. Altogether, 546 Indigenous female and 481 Indigenous male students were enrolled during this period. Figure 1 shows enrolments by year and gender, and it can be seen that there are spikes in female student enrolment for various years, whereas male enrolment is much more consistent. The ratio of female students to male students who enrolled from 2003 to 2017 is about 1.1 to 1, which is close to parity. This differs significantly from statistics mentioned above, where it was seen that almost twice as many Indigenous females than males attended undergraduate studies at university. This greater enthusiasm for Indigenous male students to enrol in an Indigenous enabling course, as compared to a mainstream undergraduate course, deserves more research. Now, figure 2 shows completions of the TEP course by year and gender. And it is here that a distinct gap can be seen between Indigenous female and male outcomes. Apart from some anomalies at each extreme of the graph, completions by Indigenous female students are consistently higher than their male counterparts. A chi-square test of 2 proportions demonstrated that 21.1% of female students had completed TEP in comparison to 13.1% of male students, which is a difference in proportion of 0.08 with a probability value of 0.001. This low p-value means that there is a high chance that the hypothesis that Indigenous female
That's
students...
10 minutes, Laurie, just letting you know.
So the low p-value means there's a high chance that the hypothesis that Indigenous female students will have higher completion rates is true, and that the result is likely to be found in the wider population of Indigenous enabling students and not just in this sample. Further statistical tests were also conducted that analysed the best outcome for TEP students according to gender. These outcomes included students who didn't complete TEP, students who completed TEP but didn't articulate, students who articulated into undergraduate studies, and TEP students who graduated from undergraduate studies. This short presentation doesn't allow much further discussion on this topic, but we can say that statistical tests showed a significant linear trend with better outcomes associated with a higher proportion of female student enrolments. So we've seen through this presentation that there is definitely a gap in educational outcomes, not only between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, but also between Indigenous female and male students. This gap has been demonstrated practically in an analysis of TEP students. But what does this all really mean? Well, firstly, it means that we cannot confidently analyse differences in educational outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians without also looking at the impacts of gender identity on race. Just as we cannot analyse gender differences in educational outcomes without also looking at the impact of racial identities on gender. So there is a greater need to study the intersectionality of race and gender in education.
That's 12 minutes.
Thank you. Secondly, cultural awareness needs to play a much greater part in the promotion of higher education, including TAFE and university, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. Many Indigenous students don't adapt well to mainstream methods of teaching and university culture, although it seems that Indigenous females are more adept to adjusting to mainstream educational cultures at school and university. Male Indigenous students seem to adapt better to more hands-on and face-to-face teaching, as shown in their improved educational outcomes at TAFE and VET. This suggests that greater attention should be paid to culturally appropriate educational systems for Indigenous Australian students. Thirdly, it may not be advantageous to encourage every Australian student, regardless of gender or race, to pursue a university career. There is a shortage of tradespeople, and this is especially so in rural and remote areas of Australia and in discrete Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. It may be beneficial to promote TAFE and other technical or further education as an option for Indigenous Australians, and particularly for Indigenous Australian males. So this brings us to the final point, which is that the gap between educational outcomes for Indigenous Australian students begins at preschool and only continues to widen, not only in terms of race, but also for gender. While it is in early childhood education that inequalities in education originate, the entire educational system needs to take issues of racial identity and gender identity into account so that every male and female, regardless of race, can reach his or her best potential outcomes. So I wish to thank you all for attendance, and I hope that you enjoyed the presentation. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks so much, Laurie. That was great. I will open it up to questions. I had a couple of questions as I was going through, but then you answered them all. So I don't have any questions myself. Does anyone else have a question? The only thing that I can think is, what about TEP, Laurie? How is TEP as a program going?
Actually, Ross, are you there? You might be better able to answer that, given that you've been around TEP now for a bit longer than me.
Yeah, it's. I think that it basically carry on from Mary's talk that we still have a long way to go, but TEP is as successful as it ever has been, but there is no huge improvements, no great leap in success rates or anything. And I think this all comes back to, you know, the Great Australian Silence and the cult of forgetfulness is still out there, really. And until educators and administrators and everything can have a greater understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, that there will be a huge gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, I think, Celeste.
And actually that really leads quite nicely back to Mary Frances's presentation, which is saying that it's not just about the students and the way that the programs are developed, but it's also about the institution and the unconscious, perhaps, institutional racism that's in place simply by the nature of the fact that we are a university that has set structures that are imposed, is that the word? Imposed by our non-Indigenous cultures. And Mary Frances, I don't know if you've been looking at the chat, but there's a question that's been asked of you. Can you see that question, Mary Frances?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Do you want to have a go at answering that?
Yeah, I would simply say that the level we are at in the academy and even in schools is such that in units I teach, you know, indigenisation of First Nation content takes place, but it's often at that general level of unravelling the colonial narrative. The idea of culturally responsive pedagogy fits into this, because good teaching is what works with First Nation kids and all children, good teaching. So culturally responsive pedagogy. So regarding the issue of in consultation with First Nation people in 500 nations, that's fine. You know, like, well, if First Nation people on country want to do that, but often that's a sort of subtle level that we're just not at. Our ignorances are profound. As you say, Celeste, about the academy, racism in the academy is apathy, it's indifference, it's failure to recognise, it's a failure of humility, and a failure to really grasp this issue, and it just reflects institutional privilege. And again, the question comes up about what should occur in each nation. We're preparing students in one unit for the Australian context. So an overall framework to understand colonisation and to engage with the indigenisation of the curriculum on a general and particular level. Culturally responsive pedagogy will be talking to country and the people in your country.
Thanks, Mary Frances. I also just want to acknowledge Melinda's comment there in the chat, and that's just in relation to the Laurie, your presentation, saying that it's great to see the data comparing Indigenous students based on gender rather than comparing Indigenous students with non-Indigenous students. So, you know, kudos to you and the researchers there. Tanya, did you want to ask the question that you've written there?
I can. I was interested because I know we have TEP that helps students transition into university, but I'm wondering if we have programs that actually help students transition into TAFE, because, you know, it's still quite a significant stepping stone for a lot of students, particularly if they haven't been in the education space for a while, and I was wondering what we were doing.
Is anyone able to answer that question?
Hi, Celeste.
Yeah, Ross, I can see your microphone unmuted. There's someone else's microphone. Rabina. Yep.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to quickly say that in regards to Tanya's question, there's a program that the uni that has just come across to Indigenous student support is the CAP-ED program, Community Aspirations program, and that's coordinated by Tasha Lamey, which I can't see her name on the screen, but yeah, she's in that type of space that also helps Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students just to build their confidence and to get into TAFE programs.
Thanks for that. Does anyone want to make a comment, ask a question of either Mary Frances or Laurie? Or of Ross? Thanks, Ross.
Can I just say, Celeste, adding to that, it's a little bit interesting in a way that the TAFE programs cost a bit to get into, and yet for university programs, you know, it's not expensive to be able to get into the program. So for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander students that are struggling financially, it seems to be a better option to go into university because it just costs, you know, a little bit too much. And the way that the framework is set up is that the same amount of support just doesn't seem to be there for the TAFE programs. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, I think that's actually quite a valid comment, Laurie. I think we would all concur with that one. Okay, any other questions, comments from anybody?
I'd just like to comment, Celeste, that I think a lot of times I did read at some stage or other that institutional racism could be defined as that even against best intentions, if the outcome is worse for Indigenous people, then it is racist. And I think a lot of the times that still continues today, that we act with the best interests towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it doesn't work that way because we're not consulting with them and we're not taking into account cultural factors and so on. We're thinking that it's the way it should be done according to our standards, and that this will help them out.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. I think that's also a very valid comment. All right, so if there are no other questions or comments, just to let you know that there's a evaluation for each of the sessions, and I would ask please to take the time to complete the evaluation. And Mary Frances actually made a really good point that maybe we're not having the right themes for conferences such as this. So if you've got any suggestions for what the themes might be, then please do take the time to complete the evaluation. It's a very short one-page survey monkey, and there's an opportunity to write some free text in there. Otherwise it's just little check boxes and smiley faces. So thank you all very much for your participation and your engagement. I will thank I would like to ask that everybody thank the presenters, please, Laurie and Mary Frances, for your great presentation. So thank you very much, both of you.